I would be discussing in this topic the Mughal builders of India, state, society, culture, and a living legacy. I will not be giving very profound ideas. I will not be acting original. I would just be summing up what has so far been done as far as the field is concerned and what is the sum total. What should we understand was the contribution of the Mughals? Are they really relevant to us today or not? That is basically what I would be talking about. Naturally, I welcome you all to what I hope will be an engaging exploration of one of the most consequential periods in Indian history. It is particularly fitting that we gather here at JNU to have this conversation because we are living through a moment when the very memory of Mughals is being contested with an intensity that would have seemed unthinkable even a generation ago. Serious attempts are being made at official levels to forget them, to treat them as foreign invaders who destroyed India, and to remember them only as barbarians and Muslim conquerors who were out to finish Hindustan and finish Hinduism. This is not simply an academic disagreement about historical interpretation. It is a deliberate project of historical erasure, an attempt to sever India from a significant portion of its own past and to construct a monolithic national identity that has no room for the complex, plural, and syncretic heritage that the Mughals represent. We are told that the Mughals were outsiders, that they had no legitimate claim to Indian soil, that their rule was nothing but a period of oppression and destruction, and that their monuments, their art, their literature, and their political ideas are alien impositions upon a pristine Hindu civilization. This narrative, however, flies in the face of the historical evidence, and because such attempts at erasure are underway, we must engage with the Mughal legacy more rigorously and thoughtfully than ever before. The Mughals were not merely conquerors who came, plundered, and left. They were builders who created institutions, forged relationships, nurtured cultural forms, and participated in the historical making of India in ways that continue to shape our lives today. To forget them is to forget a vital part of ourselves, and to reduce them to one dimensional caricatures is to impoverish our understanding of our own history. So let us begin this exploration with a commitment to historical honesty, acknowledging both the achievements and the failures, the splendor and the exploitation, the cosmopolitanism and the hierarchy, and resisting the temptation to simplify the past for the sake of present day political convenience. When we speak of the Mughals as builders of India, the mind instinctively turns towards the monumental and the visible. We think of Humayun's tomb with its perfect proportions, the sprawling red sandstone complex of Fatehpur Sikri, the imposing ramparts of the Agra fort, and the spiritual grandeur of the Jama Masjid. We think of gardens where water channels reflect the sky, palaces that speak of power and pleasure, mosques that call the faithful to prayer, tombs that commemorate the dead, and great imperial cities that housed thousands. This is entirely understandable because architecture is the most visible Mughal inheritance. Stone survives, bricks endures, and the physical fabric of their creations continue to shape our urban and rural landscapes even today. But the Mughals built much more than buildings. They built institutions that outlasted their dynasty, consolidated a territorial conception of India that had not existed in such comprehensive form for many centuries, created an administrative system that extended from the imperial center to the smallest locality, developed a remarkably integrated monetary and fiscal order, strengthened networks of roads and communications, created a cosmopolitan ruling class, and presided over an increasingly complex legal system in which imperial regulations, Islamic jurisprudence, and indigenous customs existed together in creative tension. They encouraged the expansion of cities, markets, and professional groups, and through sustained interaction among Persian, Asian, and Indian traditions, they took part in the creation of cultural forms that today appear so thoroughly Indian that we often forget the historical processes through which they emerged. The Mughal achievement was therefore not simply the construction of an empire in the narrow sense of territorial conquest and military dominance. It was the construction of an early modern Indian order, a political and economic and cultural framework that shaped the subcontinent in ways that persisted long after Mughal political authority had faded. Their empire disappeared, but much of the India that took shape during their centuries survived them. The British could defeat the Mughals, but they could not undo the Mughal transformation of India. Yet, we must also acknowledge that these are the times when people's history is being written, and we are compelled to look beyond the gilded surfaces of the imperial court to excavate the lives of the common folk who formed the actual bedrock of the Mughal world. Their labor sustained the empire, their taxes financed its splendor, and their everyday acts of survival, adaptation, and resistance shaped the lived reality of the subcontinent far more decisively than any imperial decree. Let us begin with the question of territory, because this is where the Mughal contribution to Indian political imagination is most fundamental. After the Mauryas, and particularly the empire associated with Ashoka, it was under the Mughals that an exceptionally large part of the subcontinent was once again brought within a single effective political structure. At its greatest extent, Mughal authority is stretched from Kabul and Kandahar, and the northwest approaches to Bengal in the east, from Kashmir in the north to Gujarat in the west, and eventually deep into the Deccan and southern India, incorporating territories that had never before been brought under a single imperial umbrella. The significance of this achievement lay not simply in conquest, for many rulers had conquered territories before them, but rather in creating institutions capable of holding extensive territories within a common political, fiscal, and administrative system for a sustained period, and in developing a conception of territorial sovereignty that went beyond the mere extraction of tribute. This was not the rule of alien invaders who remained perpetually foreign. It was the gradual transformation of a dynasty of Central Asian origin into an Indian imperial power, a process that unfolded over generations and fundamentally altered the relationship between the rulers and the land they ruled. This development has an interesting intellectual prehistory. Centuries earlier, Amir Khusro, in his Noh Sepeher, celebrated Hindustan as a distinctive geographical and civilizational entity, praising its climate, peoples, languages, learning, flora and fauna, and cultural achievements. Hindustan already existed in his imagination as something more than a collection of warring kingdoms. It was a place with its own character and identity. Under the Mughals, particularly from Akbar onwards, this conception acquired a more tangible political form. Akbar's expansion into Gujarat, Bengal, Kashmir, Sindh, Kabul, and Kandahar was accompanied by an increasingly systematic understanding of territory and frontier. And particularly in the northwest, he attempted to establish a strategically defensible boundary, recognizing that the empire's security required control over the passes through which invaders had historically entered. The state also attempted to know the territory it governed. And the Ain-e-Akbari is remarkable in this respect, for it records administrative divisions, revenue resources, crops, prices, routes, distances, customs, and communities with a comprehensiveness that had few precedents in Indian history. The empire was divided into subas, sarkars, and the parganas, creating a hierarchy through which authority and information could move between the center and locality, and for the first time in many centuries, much of India was being conceived not merely as territory to be conquered, but as territory to be measured, classified, administered, and connected. This was not simply an exercise in bureaucratic control. It was also an intellectual transformation, a new way of thinking about the subcontinent as a single political space with internal variations that could be understood and managed. The Mughal state was strongly centralized for an early modern polity, but its centralization did not mean that every village was governed directly from Agra or Delhi. Its achievement was more subtle and more effective, for it created a chain of institutions connecting the emperor with provincial and local society. At the center were specialized departments dealing with finance, military administration, appointments, the imperial household, religious grants, and other functions. In the provinces, the Subadar exercised military and executive authority, while the Diwan independently supervised revenue and finance, a division intended to prevent excessive concentration of provincial power. Below them stood the Faujdars, Amils, Kanungos, Chaudhuris, Qazis, Kotwals, and numerous categories of officials. The Mughal Empire was consequently held together not merely by armies but an enormous documentary apparatus. Farmans, nishans, parwanas, sanads, revenue registers, account books, reports, and correspondence circulated continuously, carrying the authority of the emperor to the furthest reaches of his domains. Paper became an instrument of empire, creating demand for a new type of person, the trained professional who could read and write, keep accounts, draft correspondence, and understand the complexities of revenue assessment and legal procedure. The Mughal administrative system generated its own human resources, creating a class of literate professionals whose expertise became essential to the state's functioning. One of the most remarkable Mughal achievements was creating a ruling class that did not correspond to a single race, region, or religion. Turanis, Iranis, Afghans, Indian Muslims, Rajputs, and other Hindu groups participated in imperial service, and later the Marathas and Deccanis were incorporated in increasing numbers. Don't believe what the NCERT of today is talking about. This was not a matter of simple tolerance. It was a deliberate policy of co-option that recognized the practical advantages of drawing upon the talents and resources of diverse communities. M. Atharali's reconstruction of the Mughal nobility showed how misleading it is to reduce this political class simply to Hindus and Muslims. For ethnicity, family, faction, patronage, military resources, administrative competence, and individual ability all mattered. The Mansabdari system gave institutional form to this cosmopolitanism. A man's rank derived formally from imperial appointment rather than hereditary status. And although aristocratic birth and family connections undoubtedly helped, they did not constitute a legally closed hereditary nobility. This was extremely important, for the Mughal ruling class was continually replenished by new entrants who brought fresh energy, new perspectives, and diverse skills to imperial service. Raja Man Singh could command imperial armies from Bengal to Afghanistan, proving that religious identity was no barrier to military leadership. Raja Todarmal became one of the architects of the revenue administration, showing that ability rather than lineage mattered most. Iranian immigrants could rise to the highest offices, and Khatris and castes could acquire important bureaucratic positions. What mattered increasingly was usefulness to the state, whether military skill, financial ability, literacy, administrative knowledge, diplomacy, medicine, artistic accomplishment, or technical ability. The Mughal state thus converted India's diversity from a problem into an administrative resource. This political system required a corresponding theory of sovereignty, and Akbar's development was truly extraordinary. In much of the early modern world, rulers were strengthening political authority through religious conformity. As Europe passed through the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, as Safavid Iran increasingly identified political authority with Twelver Shiism, and as the Ottoman state projected itself as a great defender of Sunni Islam, the Mughal experiment under Akbar moved in another direction entirely, articulating a conception of sovereignty that was not tied to any single religious community. He ruled because he held sovereignty, and sovereignty carried the obligation to provide justice and protection to all his subjects. Abul Fazl provided the most sophisticated exposition of this principle, arguing that the sovereign had to stand above sectarian disputes precisely because the population over which he ruled followed different religions, customs, and intellectual traditions. This was the political foundation of Sulh-e-Kul, universal peace, a principle that went far beyond mere toleration to embrace active engagement with diverse traditions. It would be anachronistic to call the Mughal state secular in exactly the constitutional sense in which we use the term today. But it would be equally inaccurate to call it a theocratic Islamic state. The emperor did not derive his authority from the ulama, nor was enforcing Islamic law on every subject the fundamental basis of his sovereignty. The ruler's legitimacy increasingly rested on his ability to provide justice, security, and equilibrium among diverse groups. This marked an enormously important development in Indian political thought. The recognition that the state could belong to people of different religions without requiring them to share the ruler's religion. The principle that emerged under Akbar went further than mere toleration, for tolerance implies that one dominant community permits another to exist on terms set by the dominant group. Whereas the Mughal principle suggested that political service should not be determined solely by religious affiliation, that the emperor's protection should extend across communities, and that difference itself did not constitute political disloyalty. The abolition of jizya and pilgrimage taxes, the Rajput alliances, the recruitment of Hindu officials, the religious discussions at Fatehpur Sikri, and the translation of Sanskrit works into Persian were different manifestations of this larger intellectual transformation. Abul Fazl's account of Hindu society in the Ain-e-Akbari is especially significant. For he tried to explain Hindu philosophy, social organization, calendars, pilgrimage, ritual, learning, and religious practices to a Persian reading imperial audience. Why should the chief ideologue of a Muslim-born emperor devote so much intellectual energy to understanding Hindu traditions? The answer is because knowledge of the people had become a condition of just government. One could not govern Hindustan while staying intellectually indifferent to the beliefs and customs of most of its inhabitants. The same pragmatism characterized Mughal law. Islamic jurisprudence certainly remained important, and under Aurangzeb, the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri represented an enormous scholarly effort to systematize Hanafi jurisprudence. But Mughal India was not governed simply according to the Shariat. For Ziyabarni had already recognized during the Sultanate period that the government required zawabit, secular law, regulations made by the ruler, which could not simply be derived from religious jurisprudence. The Mughals developed this principle further as imperial orders, administrative regulations, and precedents operated alongside Islamic jurisprudence. Indigenous customs continued to regulate extensive areas of social life. For Hindu communities were not generally compelled to abandon their customs of marriage, inheritance, property and caste regulations, and panchayats, caste institutions, zamindars and local bodies continued to exercise judicial and mediatory functions. Actual Mughal law was therefore plural. For Shariat, Zawabit, imperial authority, and local customary law existed within the overlapping jurisdictions. Surviving legal documents reveal, and that too from Gujarat, reveal women, merchants, artisans, and property holders appearing before courts as purchasers, sellers, witnesses, and litigants, exercising rights that were not simply granted by the state, but were recognized as inherent in their social positions. The legal world of the Mughal India was much more complicated than the simplistic proposition that Muslim emperors governed Hindus through Islamic law. Incidentally, even the term Shariat, which today is interpreted only as Muslim law, stood for just a legal system, nothing else. We have evidence that Sahib-e-Shara, a legal expert who was called by the Qazi to decide a case, was a Brahmin and not a Maulvi or an Alim. Political unity required material connections. The development and widespread circulation of a stable silver rupee helped create an increasingly integrated monetary economy. For gold mohurs, silver rupees and copper dams circulated within an organized currency system, and Najaf Haider is sitting here. He has worked on this. Roads connected capitals, provincial centers, ports, and military frontiers and sarais provided facilities for merchants, travelers, officials, and pilgrims. Wells, bridges, and ferries facilitated movement, and the postal and intelligence system carried reports across enormous distances. The state was consequently linked by several simultaneous networks: roads that moved people and commodities, currency that moved value, postal networks that moved information, and documents that moved authority. The political integration of the empire thus encouraged economic and social integration, creating a subcontinent that was more connected than ever before. But this magnificent imperial structure rested upon the village, and Irfan Habib's great contribution to Mughal historiography was to prove the agrarian foundations of the empire. Agricultural surplus sustained the state, the army, the nobility, the cities, and much of the cultural world that we associate with Mughal civilization. The revenue reforms associated particularly with Akbar and Raja Totarbal represented an enormous attempt to rationalize assessment through measurement, classification, productivity, and prices. The state needed information about fields, crops, and resources, and it developed sophisticated methods for gathering and processing it. Yet, the countryside was not simply administered from above, for zamindars remained crucial intermediaries. Some controlled extensive territories and armed retainers, while others held rights over only a few villages. I would recommend that you go through the works of Professor Nurul Hasan. The Mughal state usually attempted to incorporate rather than eliminate them, recognizing that local power structures could be harnessed for imperial purposes. This created another characteristic feature of Mughal governance: centralization combined with negotiated local authority. Now, we must turn our attention to the common people who form the overwhelming majority of the Mughal population, for as these are the times when people's history is being written, we cannot allow the grand narratives of the emperors and nobles to obscure the lives of those who actually built the empire. Let us begin with the countryside, because most of the Mughal population, as much as 85 to 90%, lived in the villages. The magnificent imperial edifice rested upon the agricultural surplus generated by the peasantry, the Rayyat, as the revenue records called them. The Mughal state extracted a substantial portion of the peasants' produce, often amounting to as much as a third or even half of the gross yield. The Amils and Kanungos measured the fields, classified the soil, and fixed the cash equivalent of the crop. This imposition of a monetary revenue demand on a subsistence-oriented peasantry created enormous pressure, forcing cultivators into the market economy. The peasant was not a free agent, but a producer enmeshed in a complex fiscal web, perpetually vulnerable to the vagaries of the monsoon, the exactions of the faujdar, and the demands of the zamindar. Yet, the life of the common peasant was one of unremitting toil and chronic insecurity. Famine was a recurring scourge, and the Great Deccan Famine of 1630 and 1632 stands as a stark testament to the fragility of commoners' existence. We have vivid descriptions of corpses littering the roads, villages completely depopulated, and the living reduced to eating the most unwholesome substances. Even in normal times, the peasant surplus was relentlessly extracted, and the burden of begar or forced labor added another dimension of exploitation. It is these anonymous peasants, carters and herders who populate the margins of imperial miniatures, yet their names are rarely recorded and their voices reach us only as an echo. Moving from the countryside to the towns and cities, we meet another world of common labor. The great imperial workshops, the karkhanas, employed thousands of artisans, weavers, spinners, metal workers, carpet makers, and embroiderers. The weavers, particularly in the textile centers of Gujarat, Bengal, and the Coromandel coast, were often trapped in a system of dependency on merchants and brokers who advanced them raw materials and demanded finished goods at prices that barely allowed for subsistence, creating a form of proto-industrial proletariat. The construction of the great Mughal cities required armies of laborers, stone cutters, brick makers, and mortar carriers. And while the master architects might earn the patronage of the emperor, the ordinary construction worker is commemorated only by individual symbols left on the stones. The daily life of the urban poor was concentrated in crowded neighborhoods where water was scarce, sanitation was rudimentary, and the threat of fire or epidemic was never far away. Yet these spaces were also vibrant with the rhythm of petty commerce. I would recommend that please go through the account of Francois Bernier, for example, for Delhi. We must also address the persistence of caste hierarchies among the common people. The lower caste, particularly those designated as untouchables, were subjected to social ostracism, segregation, and degrading forced labor. The Mughal revenue records reveal a society strictly ordered by ritual status, and the state was generally content to collect its revenue and maintain order without interfering in these deeply rooted hierarchies. The tribal and forest-dwelling communities, such as the Bhils and Gonds, inhabited regions beyond direct control, and the Mughal state often launched punitive expeditions to bring them under control, a process that often involved brutal warfare and displacement. Common people also had their own forms of political expression and resistance. The widespread peasant revolts of the late 17th century, particularly the Jat rebellion and the Satnami uprising of 1665 and 1672, erupted when grievances became unbearable. The Jats rose under local chieftains and established a formidable resistance that controlled large areas of the countryside. The Satnamis, a religious sect of low-caste weavers and laborers who preached equality, were crushed only with the utmost difficulty. The great Maratha expansion drew upon the grievances of the Maratha peasantry against the Mughal revenue system. There were also quite everyday forms of resistance, as peasants manipulated revenue records, concealed produce, fled to neighboring territories, or simply refused to pay. The village community functioned as a shield against external exactions, and the Qazi courts provided an arena for asserting commoners' rights. The intellectual and cultural life of the common people, flourished through the Bhakti and Sufi movements, whose devotional songs articulated a vision of social equality and spiritual liberation that resonated deeply with the aspirations of the poor and marginalized. Now we must turn to a subject historically neglected even more than the common people themselves: women and gender in Mughal society. For too long, the history of women has been reduced either to the romanticized figures of the imperial harem or to the completely silent peasant woman. The reality is far more complex. The imperial household was an important political and economic institution. Gulbadan Bano wrote history, providing a rare female perspective. Hamida Bano Begum exercised dynastic authority as Akbar's mother. Noor Jahan participated in politics and patronage to an unprecedented extent, issuing farmans in her own name and effectively governing the empire alongside Jahangir. Jahanara Begum controlled substantial wealth, sponsored architecture, and participated in maritime commerce, as did even women even under the period of Akbar. Zebun Nasa became known for his scholarship and poetry. The harem was therefore a site of property, diplomacy, patronage, and dynastic politics. Outside the imperial household, women of noble classes also exercised influence, managing households, supervising education, and engaging in commercial activities. Surviving legal documents reveal women appearing before the Qazi as purchasers, sellers, and litigants, proving that they possessed legal rights to property. The institution of the Vakil allowed women to conduct cases without appearing in person. The practice of meher, which is there actually in Islamic Shariat, provided women with financial security, and numerous legal cases indicate that women actively asserted their rights. But then, when I am talking of meher here, I am not only talking about the Muslim women. We have a number of documents in Delhi itself, in National Archives of India, which show that even Hindu women could claim and get meher. However, most women were peasant women, laborers, artisans, domestic servants, and petty traders. The village woman was an indispensable part of the agrarian economy, working in fields alongside her male kin, transplanting rice, weeding the crops, and harvesting the grain while simultaneously managing the household, grinding flour, collecting fuel and water, and attending to livestock. In the towns, women participated extensively in the spinning of cotton and silk, a form of domestic labor that connected the countryside to the great centers of textile production, and our most reliable evidence suggests that women from the poorer classes often outnumbered men in spinning and food processing sectors. This was exploitation as well, but they were contributing something. The judicial records reveal a world of women who were active economic agents, appearing before the qazis as litigants, sellers, and property owners. And while the patriarchal structures of the time severely constrained their choices, particularly regarding marriage and inheritance, the common women of Mughal India was far from the passive, silent figure that the court chronicles might suggest. I would also add here that read one of the documents which has been dealt with by Irfan Saab in his book on Vrindavan, where he shows that it was the daughter who would inherit the library and the books from his deceased father, not the sons. The question of parda operated very differently across classes. For elite women, parda was a sign of honor associated with material resources that allowed them to avoid public labor. For the vast majority who had to work, parda was a luxury they could not afford, and they moved freely through fields and bazaars. The Bhakti and Sufi movements offered women opportunities for spiritual expression, and the poet Saint Mirabai became a powerful symbol of female spiritual autonomy. The legal system was shaped by patriarchal assumptions, yet women found ways to assert their agency and protect their interests. Now let us turn to the cultural achievements of the Mughals. Mughal architecture was never merely Persian architecture transplanted to India. Fatehpur Sikri demonstrates this magnificently, with arches and domes existing beside Strabiate construction, brackets, chhatris, and forms derived from Indian building traditions. Sohail Hashmi Sahab is here, and he gives very beautiful lectures on this theme. The Taj Mahal brought together architects, engineers, calligraphers, and stone workers and craftsmen from diverse backgrounds. The result was Mughal architecture, an Indian architecture became an Indian architectural style. Yet, we must remember that creating these buildings depended on the labor of thousands of anonymous workers whose contribution was essential. The marks they left on these stones are a silent testimony to their existence. The same was true of painting. Humayun brought Persian-trained painters into his service, but Akbar's atelier recruited large numbers of Indian artists. Persian manuscript conventions met Indian color, landscape, physiognomy, and narrative traditions, and European engravings later introduced additional visual possibilities. A new artistic language emerged, synthesizing diverse influences. Under Jahangir, this reached extraordinary levels of naturalistic observation, as Ustad Mansoor's studies of birds and animals demonstrate. The Mughal atelier became a place where cultural traditions met and were transformed. Perhaps an even more profound encounter occurred through translation. Akbar's court-sponsored Persian translations of Sanskrit works, including the Mahabharata, which became the Razmnama, as well as the Ramayana. These projects required Sanskrit scholars, Persian writers, translators, and interpreters to work together. Abul Fazl's study of Hindu philosophy belonged to the same intellectual environment as did Dara Shikoh's Majma'ul Bahrain and his Persian translation of the Upanishads, the Sirre Akbar, which helped introduce the Upanishadic tradition to European intellectual circles. Language itself was transformed through this encounter. Persian became the language of imperial administration, but it did not extinguish India's vernacular traditions. Braj, Awadhi, Bengali, Punjabi, Dakhini, and other languages flourished. Persian became increasingly Indianized, and the long interaction of Persian, Arabic, and Turkish vocabularies with North Indian vernaculars contributed to the linguistic environment from which Urdu emerged. Languages remember histories that political rhetoric sometimes tries to forget. Music best illustrates cultural synthesis. As Abul Fazl lists musicians who were Hindu, Iranian, Turani, and Kashmiri. Courtly, devotional, and regional traditions interacted over generations as Dhrupad flourished and Sufi musical traditions developed. By the 18th century, as Dargah Quli Khan's Muraqqai-e-Delhi reveals, Delhi was filled with musicians, singers, dancers, poets, and performers whose reputations extended beyond courtly establishments. At that point, asking whether a particular musical form was Hindu or Muslim becomes increasingly meaningless, for it had become Indian. Religious life contributed to social interaction. Sufi dargahs attracted nobles and laborers, merchants and artisans, women and men, creating spaces where different communities met one another. The annual Urs combined prayer, food distribution, music, commerce, and pilgrimage. Hindu pilgrimage centers produced similar networks of movement and exchange. Muharram too created shared spaces as Sunni communities participated in many regions and Hindu artisans became involved in the material and ritual culture. Festivals similarly created public culture for the Mughal city and countryside was organized around multiple calendars. A fair or mela was simultaneously religious, commercial, and recreational. And that is how shared cultures are created, not by eliminating difference, but by producing places in which difference repeatedly encounters difference. The same process occurred in cuisine, as Central Asian and Persian culinary traditions encountered Indian ingredients and dietary cultures, creating dishes that became so deeply Indian that separating their supposed foreign and indigenous components is often historically pointless. The greatest proof of Mughal state building comes after the decline of the Mughal power. When the empire fragmented during the 18th century, its institutions did not disappear. Awadh, Bengal, Hyderabad, and other successor states continued to employ Mughal administrative practices. Maratha power interacted extensively with Mughal fiscal and administrative institutions. Even the East India Company initially entered Indian politics through the Mughal system, obtaining the Diwani of Bengal from Shah Alam II in 1765. Persian stayed an official administrative language until 1837, and the colonial state built extensively upon institutions, personnel, and knowledge inherited from the society it conquered. Then came 1857. By this time, Bahadur Shah Zafar possessed little effective political power. Yet, when the soldiers of the East India Company rebelled, they marched towards Delhi and proclaimed the Mughal Emperor as their sovereign. More than 3 centuries after Babur's victory at Panipat, the Mughal Emperor could function as a symbol around which soldiers and political groups could imagine a common authority. The British understood the symbolism perfectly, abolishing the dynasty and exiling Zafar to Rangoon. But Mughal India could not be extinguished with it. Here we must make an important distinction. The Mughals did not create modern India, which emerged from many historical processes. Nor should Akbar be transformed into a 20th century secular democrat. But it would be equally poor history to deny the extraordinary Mughal contribution. A very large part of the subcontinent became accustomed to belonging to a common political framework. A territorial state developed administrative connections from the center to the locality. A uniform currency eased exchange, and roads and postal networks increased mobility. A common administrative language connected regions without dropping vernaculars. A cosmopolitan ruling class incorporated people of different ethnicities and religions, and professional ability became an increasingly important route to mobility. A plural legal order accommodated different traditions. Great cities became meeting grounds for diverse communities, and cultural interaction created new forms of architecture, painting, music, literature, language, and food. Most importantly, a political principle appeared which recognized that India was too diverse to belong exclusively to any single religious community. Sulekul remained the most important Mughal political legacy. Its importance lies in recognizing the problem of governing a society in which people worship differently, speak different languages, observe different customs, and possess different histories. One answer is domination. The Mughal experiment, at its most creative, proposed another answer, that the sovereign should stand above sectarian identity, that political loyalty should not require religious conformity, and that different communities should have access to the state. Through these encounters, categories themselves began to change. The India that emerged from Mughal rule was not culturally uniform. but it was interconnected. Babur came to India as a conqueror, but his descendants stayed, married here, were born here, died here, and were buried here. Their armies became Indian armies. Their nobility became an Indian nobility. Their Persian became Indian Persian. Their architecture became Indian architecture. Their painting became Indian painting. Their food became Indian food. And their music became inseparable from Indian music. Their empire became an Indian empire. And this transformation from conquest to belonging is one of the most important processes in the history of Mughal India. I'm just finishing. The deeper achievement was the recognition that unity did not require uniformity. India could have many religions without becoming the property of one. Many languages without requiring everybody to speak one. And innumerable communities while incorporating them into overlapping political, economic, and cultural networks. The empire remained hierarchical. Its revenue demands could be severe. Its wars could be destructive. Religious conflict existed. Caste oppression persisted. Women lived within powerful patriarchal structures. And poverty and inequality was real. Everything was not hunky-dory. Mughal India should neither be romanticized nor converted into a golden age. But historical significance does not require perfection. The question is whether an age created institutions, relationships, and cultural forms that changed the historical trajectory of the society that followed it by that standard. Mughal achievement was enormous. The Taj Mahal is one of its monuments, but not its greatest. The greater monument is India itself. Not because the Mughals created India, and certainly not because nothing existed before them, but because they took part decisively in transforming an ancient civilizational space into an increasingly interconnected political and economic and cultural world. Their empire eventually disappeared, but the society it had created did not. The British could depose Bahadur Shah, abolish the Mughal dynasty, remove Persian from administration, dismantle parts of Shahjahanabad, and rewrite history of the regime they had conquered. But they could not undo 3 centuries of social interaction. Nor can we, for the Mughal inheritance is not something standing outside us which we may choose either to admire or reject. It has long since entered the historical formation of the society in which we live, and the continuing relevance of the Mughals lies precisely here. They remind us that India was built not by isolation but by encounter, not by cultural purity but by historical interaction, and not by excluding difference but by repeatedly finding political and social mechanisms for living with it. The Mughal Empire is gone, but Mughal India became part of India, and in that sense, the Mughals remain among the great builders of the India we inhabit today. Thank you very much.